concern is always to be an innovative institution, both for our students and society as a whole. The webinars are offered daily by our units at FGV. They are a way to promote the exchange of knowledge in several areas about important topics: information, research, plurality of ideas, discussions in high level. All of this happening free, online, and daily. Welcome to another FGV webinar. Transmission is about to start. This is a disclaimer.
Muito bem-vindos.
Welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Elections, Polarizations, and Social Media. What can we learn using the election processes here in Brazil, in Germany, how this happened in the social media, and the political transformation that we are seeing in the past years. I'm very happy to be here with you and Petria Chaves. I'm a journalist from the CBN network, and I'm very much interested in this topic. And I'm sure that this will be a very fruitful afternoon with a lot of exchange, lessons learned, everything that we saw happening, especially now in these past few weeks. And I'm very anxious for this talk. Before we introduce our panelists, I would like to invite to tell us a little bit about this event Amaro Grassi. He is coordinator of the Communication School of FGV, and he is taking care of this project, Digital Network, together with Brasília. And I would like you to welcome those who are attending. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you, Petria. And good afternoon to all those who are with us, Luciana, our international guest, Johannes, Hillje, and Marcos, and all the partners, and say and highlight that it is always a pleasure and an honor to promote events like this, especially in a project that is already in its third edition. This partnership between the Communication School Media from FGV and the Embassy of Germany here in Brazil. It's a project that since 2020 has been promoting activities related to this big topic of digital democracy or digitalization of democracy. What are the impacts that this brings to society as a whole, but more specifically in policies? And this is the topic we are bringing here. So the impact of social media, of polarization in the election is not something new, but on the other hand, it gives us the chance of see a good amount of experiences, of impacts, and also what is possible to do to stop negative impacts in this sense. This debate is a debate that for a while we were trying to promote with the embassy, especially to try to make an approximation between Germany's experience that recently went through an election that is recognized as a country that managed somehow, and I'm very anxious to hear Johannes, a country that managed somehow to stop the more negative effects of this polarization or of the misinformation in general. And why not now analyzing the hot Brazilian elections that brings to us a series of lessons learned about what worked, what didn't work, and what can still be done, thinking of the next elections. So it will be a very interesting debate, very qualified, and that has this purpose. of putting together two experiences, Brazil's and Germany's, that can deep dive even more in the topic and show us their experience so that we can learn everything about this in this sense. So I wish you all a good participation. Thank you all for your attendance and all those who are with us, like Petria, a partner always in initiatives of this project. So I will just show you our disclaimers saying that everything that is said by the speakers here and by our guests represent exclusively their own opinions and not necessarily the institutional position of FGV. We repeat that all here present agreed in participating in this event spontaneously, and also that allows us to use this image for this transmission that will be made available later on the official channels of FGV. So thank you, Petria, and a good debate to you all. Amaro, I thank you. And I already for a long time been doing a follow-up of the work that you do in the Fundação Getulio Vargas. It's a pioneer work considering all the world, and it's very nice to be able to do this follow-up of this debate today. And before calling our guest, I would like to call Emil Richter, who is from the German embassy. And we have a lot of partners and a lot of lessons learned, especially now after our elections, and things that we can share in this afternoon. So, Emil, good afternoon. Good afternoon to all. Thank you, Petria, for your introduction. Good evening for those who are following us from Germany, from Europe. I believe it's night over there. So I'm Emil Richter from the German Embassy. I'm responsible for the Forum of Democracy Brazil-Europe, who is our dialogue about the rule of law and this scope that we make partnerships and organize events like this one of today to debate issues related to democracy, rule of law, and that's something that is important to Brazil and to us in Germany and Europe. I would like to start thanking the partnership with FGV, with Amaro Grassi and Marco Ruediger, who are today with us. And it's a very good partnership and with a lot of success for many years. And also to thank the holding of today's event, and also thank other participants, Johannes, Hillje from Germany, Luciana, Veiga. Very important to have you all with us today. And I also believe, as Amaro said, that the topic that we're going to discuss today is extremely relevant for many democratic countries. And the moment that we are going through now, that is very timely, because we can see the lessons in Brazil and the experience that we had here with the challenges brought by the digital world, and compare the experiences we were with what we saw in Germany in the most recent elections that happened not more than a year ago. So then we can start our debate, and I would like to highlight that we were very much impressed as the Germany embassy with the electoral process of this year that happened in a very polarized environment. But it was a very smooth, calm process, admirable. Not only we in Germany expressed our admiration, but the whole democratic world congratulated Brazil, because it was an exemplary process, and not only on the way how it was organized, but how the challenge of fake news was dealt with in the partnership with FGV. It was very impressive. So I believe that we have a lot to learn with Brazil. We in Germany, we in Europe, and actually we have sometimes mentioned that we fully trust in the Brazilian democracy, in the Brazilian institutions, and I can say that this trust was fully confirmed. And now we have this impressive result. So I'm very happy that today we have this opportunity of exchanging experiences, Brazil and Germany, and we continue doing this because actually, as Amaro said, we have a lot to learn from each other. So thank you very much for the attendees and for the speakers, and I wish you all a very good debate. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Emil. I think the beginning, the opening of this conversation couldn't have been better with the points that you bring up, considering democracy, rule of law, a digital stage today that is very strong. A lot is transformed, and we see politics happening in practice. This will be one of the topics today in this conversation. We'll have Luciana Veiga, as you've mentioned, who's the president of the Brazilian Association of Political Sciences, talking about the construction of this democratic pillar in Brazil, how this is happening, how she evaluates it, this electoral process in Brazil. Today we have, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, I'm going to tell you a little bit who our guests are, and call our first panelist. We see everyone here on the conversation today. We have, as it's been mentioned in the beginning, Johannes. He is a political consultant and of communication in Berlin. He's a specialist in communication strategies, and he works in politics and government for various institutions and political parties. And he's authored several books in the topic, putting politics, communication, new types in politics. He's going to be our first panelist today at the webinar. And then we talk to Luciana Veiga. She is a professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro and president of the Brazilian Association of Political Science. And then before moving to questions that you're going to ask us, the points that you bring up, we're going to crown the conversation with Marco Ruediger, who's a PhD in sociology and director or dean of the School of Communication, Media and Information at the Getulio Vargas Foundation, a person I am very pleased to work very closely to and following analysis. And I would like to feel how we're going to tie all this conversation together. I'd like to start the webinar with Johannes, Hillje, consultant in politics and communication, to tell us about the electoral and political process in Germany last year. And perhaps as he can tell us about this, perhaps make an assessment as to how he observed the electoral process in Brazil, all of this talking about democracy, digital stage. Johannes, good afternoon to you. Good evening for those of you in Germany. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Guten Tag allerseits und viele Grüße aus Berlin, das stimmt.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much. In Berlin, it's already evening. It's dark. And before anything else, I'd like to apologize. Unfortunately, I do not speak Portuguese, so my language skills are not enough. So I'm going to speak German. We have interpreters today, and they are doing it quite beautifully, and I can follow in Germany what you're saying in Portuguese and vice versa. I cordially thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to have this debate. We followed elections in Brazil very attentively, especially regarding the topics that we're going to discuss at this webinar today. How democratic elections in the era of social media, polarized debate take place, and how they can be successful despite of it all. It is a great opportunity for me to learn from your elections right after the elections. I'd like to report that we've been very relieved with the smooth running of the elections and peaceful. That will happen afterwards. There was certain tension in the air. We follow that in Germany because Brazil is an important country. This is the perception of everyone. Therefore, the general feeling was of relief that started increasing when it was clear that it would be a transition in peace, as it should be in a democracy. Now, on my very brief statement, I would like to talk about the situation in Germany, 2021. We had elections for the federal parliament, and I'd like to focus on three aspects. I'd like to talk about democracy in Germany. The first point is that social media currently are a major source of information for citizens and voters also in Germany, but it is not the main source. Last year, the most important channel was TV. 80% of voters were informed on elections via TV, and social media also was used, and half of voters use this medium to obtain information on elections. So the platforms are similar. Facebook ranks first in terms of political information, followed by Instagram, WhatsApp, and YouTube, which are main channels. Telegram as well. Thinking about society in general, they do not perform great role. Only few people use them, but we see that voters of radical areas, they use Telegram quite a lot. 20% of radical political parties that also were part of our parliament use telegrams. Half of voters have used social media to obtain information. The use of social media in general is bigger. Around 86% of Germans use social media regularly for everything you can imagine, to speak to friends, to chat, to shop, and to do this and that, but it is less used for political information. And why is it like this in Germany? It leads me to my second point. This has to do with trust. When we analyze the trust or reliability of various information sources, we realize that in different channels, newspapers, TV, radio, social media are those or the part or those that have the least trust. Most people assess that they are not credible. They do not believe in social media. This is because why social media channels have not been used so much for people to get information on politics. So there is greater acceptance and trust on TV and radio channels and stations that are both public and private, which have high quality programs. The same applies to journalism, and this shows that this can be an effective instrument against polarization and such type of speeches. This also means to Germany that the electors or voters that do not trust traditional channels that are established and do not have so much trust in democratic institutions are more open to the information on social media. The relationship, distrust of traditional media and use of social media and misinformation hasn't been explained, but this only impacts a minority. And this leads me to my third point, which is related to the following. Disinformation is a problematic phenomenon also to German democracy. Actually, every day we are exposed to disinformation, especially through social media. We have orchestrated campaigns of disinformation coming from abroad and also from within Germany. From Germany, we had disinformation basically on the pandemic, COVID-19, on vaccines, their effect, and everything very guided. There was massive disinformation. There we have actors consciously and directly that want to delegitimize the democratic system in Germany mostly, but not only coming from the field, which is more right wing. And when we see what comes from abroad, we have basically disinformation coming from Russia, and currently it's more related to the war in Ukraine. Part of disinformation is not easy to fight against, much on the contrary. Society, the public in general, and justice, because the disinformation does not convey content that are prone to be actually reported. So we don't have contents that are prone to be immediately punished. Therefore, they can be disseminated quite efficiently. But we have another part of disinformation that contains contents that are illegal. For example, hate speech. And also, we have instruments here of as to how to go about it. We have a law that actually enforces social media laws. So it's an NetzDG or DG. This is to fight hate speech, illegal contents on platforms. And the core of this law establishes that platform operators like Google have to remove illegal contents within 24 hours. The contents must be deleted. If it is not clear whether the content is legal or illegal, if there's a bit more time, the timeline is 7 days, but they have to do something, control, fact check to see whether the content is within legality or not. And after 5 years, we have the first studies that have analyzed the efficacy of the law. And there is a study carried out by a renowned institute, the Leibniz Institute, that wrote the condition that on Twitter, just for the Twitter platform, due to this law, there was less hate speech at about 10%. The law is not perfect, but it does have a positive impact. And therefore, the German law has become a model to regulate Europe. And we had an approval of the European Parliament, the Digital Services Act, and it was based on the format of the German law. Before closing, to sum up, of course, in Germany, social media also worsens polarization and debate. We've seen that during the pandemic, but we do not have a society that is so polarized. And this is also related to our political system, parliamentary democracy with various parties, and the governments are usually made up by coalitions, usually 2 parties, currently 3 parties, and this reinforces cooperation that is between parties, intra-party cooperation. It forces parties to cooperate amongst themselves, and therefore we somewhat limit this dispute because the parties have to cooperate. At the same time, we have means or journalism media of good quality, both public and private, that generate trust. And this trust in communication media contribute to the resilience in society, and therefore we can better face those phenomena. I think I'm going to stop here. I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you very much. Brilliant, Johannes. I took so many notes, running out of paper regarding the points that you brought up, that I'd like to actually call our second guest, that is Luciana Veiga, president of the Brazilian Association of Political Science. Well, adding to what Johannes tells us about the electoral process in Germany, he mentions some points, Luciana, that are important, which is the trust in institutions. He talks a bit about the parliamentary democracy, which is different from ours. And I'd like to understand whether this difference, how this is reflected, our political method, how is this reflected in the polarization and your analysis? Once said what's happened in Germany in his viewpoint. How have you seen our electoral process that started with a lot of apprehension? I'd like you to give us a kind of results, the bottom line, and then we have Marco. Okay, good afternoon, Luciana.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation, so nice, and to make a summary to me in a very interesting way, turning the floor from Johannes to me. So first of all, before I start this discussion, I would like to thank you for the presentation. I would like to thank and say that it is a pleasure to be here, welcoming Amaro, Emil, Johannes, Marco Aurelio, and all the attendees. So it's very nice to be here to discuss a very recent topic such as it is this one, and only tackling on one point. I just left the ABCP presidency, so I have been updating myself in the past few days, and I would like to mention a little bit this position of being able to understand a little bit how this success of the social media, how does it become so efficient? Why is it so difficult to restrict the effect of the social media here in Brazil? What is the balance that we have here in terms of behavior of the voters, their values? And here I will answer exactly what Petria asked, because the trust is an issue that is very important here. It's a key issue. Johannes mentioned, in his speech, I believe that trust is the key for democracy, and the lack of trust in the institutions and the lack of trust, interpersonal lack of trust, hurts democracy a lot and overloads the institutions in the moment when we have to protect the electoral process with a debate on fraud and all the fake news that we were able to see. So at the end of the presentation, we are going to arrive to this point, but I just wanted to go a little bit back to the electoral process and say that we had a very polarized election, and this polarized happened since April 2021, when the incumbent, when the former president, now President Lula, has his convictions made null and void by the Supreme Court, allowing him then to run for elections. And that moment coincided with one of the hardest moments of the pandemics of COVID-19 here in Brazil, where we saw a steep rise in the number of casualties. In this moment, we have an increase. The former president and current president appears in this race, and it grows very much. At the same time, the satisfaction with the incumbent government goes down very rapidly because of the casualties. It's important to mention this because not always in the beginning of the pandemic, President Bolsonaro was badly assessed. It's important to say that in that moment, when you had the problem of lockout, when the president appears against the lockdown and against social isolation, still he doesn't lose very much in his assessment, because he was verbalizing somehow the concern of many Brazilians that call themselves self-employed, because he has a big support of this part of the population that are self-employed and are not within the labor legislation. So he can vocalize very much with this segment of the electorate. So until then, he was not losing very much. But then when the casualty comes, and when the president questions the vaccine, was a watershed in his behavior. And then, yes, you see a big dissatisfaction with his government. After that, both candidacies appear. So you see Lula coming as a leader in this race, and Bolsonaro appears as a second place in a picture that with a few changes of vote intention shows a uniform trend until the first round. We see that it will maintain in the race in a general way on the first shift or in the first round. It happens like this. So why do we see this polarization taking place? My argument here, some colleagues already say that there is a polarization which is ideological with the Brazilian voters. This means that what happened in 2018 was not a dot out of the curve. So the strengthening of the now President Bolsonaro wouldn't be a dot out of the curve. Some colleagues say that Bolsonaro was able to organize and channel and bring to the centrality in the moment of the decision for the vote. The Brazilian tend to be very traditional, and this traditionality that maintains itself throughout the years. So what these colleagues say is that the Brazilians have always been very traditional. They like to be conservative, and what happens in this moments when PT wins the elections, then we see the role of Lulism that André Teixeira even mentions. What does Lula do? He brings a unity to all and puts in the second place the ideological issue. So when Lula does that and he presents a Brazil plan of economy that is going to improve the lifestyle of everybody, then you have this moment, a process when the left wing wins the country, and then you have both governments of Lula and both administrations of Lula, which is when we stop a process that was important to her, which was to guarantee the purchasing power of the Brazilian citizen. Then the Brazilians, they adhere very much to this speech of corruption, removes the support, and in a second term in office, from January to March, President Dilma loses 20 to 30% of the support of the public opinion very quickly. And in this process, we see a segment of the political science that interacting that issue that we have this conservatism in Brazil, and it is not a dot outside the curve. In this aspect, we have some colleagues that have rescued the point of how was the conservatism, just like with Carlos Lacerda, that reviewing the theory with what Glaucio Soares wrote about the UDN, the political party of that president, and some colleagues talking about the phenomenon of Paulo Maluf, that was very much in tune with the conservatism in São Paulo. And you have all these studies there to try to rescue and identify in Bolsonarism components of the traditional conservatism. We also have to mention some components here. When we think of what it was, this Bolsonarism, we have to talk about populism. And I would even call your attention to three components. The first would be related to populism being very much linked to a crisis in democracy. So it always comes with a speech anti-system. It is as if actually that liberalism, that progressist liberalisms of the past few years didn't manage to deliver social welfare that people expected, and because of this, we would have a reactionary populism a populism with a more authoritarian footprint. And this would be then a first component in Bolsonarism, this anti-system speech. The second point that I would also mention in this conservatism, which is very typical of populism, is an idea that we always highlight a moral perspective. So the big point of Bolsonaro is not the programs of his administration, but the moral perspective and the moral reading that we do about everything, corruption, the behaviors, a moral reading of his politics, which is essential to go to the speech of anti-system. And a point also very important in Bolsonarism is an anti-intellectual behavior. This anti-intellectual behavior is very typical of this movement of populism. So in this approach with an appeal of the people, a perception of a crisis that has to be overcome, this anti-intellectualism goes very well hand in hand with a component of the politically correct, of the bad ways, and this is accepted. So many times we see when President Bolsonaro spoke in a very rough way, he said, oh, that's his way of speaking. That's his way of speaking. And it's a much better way than those people who speak nicely, but they are false. And those are the people that belong to the elite. So Bolsonaro would be a very sincere person from the people. So you have this very strong component. It is important to analyze these components of populism from President Bolsonaro as a performance action that has its own personality, that takes us to a political confrontation. So one of his components is the conflict, the contention of creating difficulties and identities where I identify myself and those I oppose to. And that's why President has used very strongly the theory of conspiracy. The theory of conspiracy is used exactly to form among us an identity and to move away from the others who represent a different identity. In this case, conflict is essential so that you can organize both the foundations that are included in this dispute in a strongly polarized reality, exactly because of this populism. And analyzing like this, what I would like to bring to you to sustain this point that I mentioned related to the conservatism of resilience. I will bring you here information about the research, The Face of Democracy, is a research made by a pool of universities, among which we see FMG. I would like to call your attention to the following. The number of Brazilians that are in favor of the reduction of the legal majority, 70% of them, they are in favor of reducing penal majority. The number of Brazilians that are in favor that schools teach children to play and to believe in God, 82% of the Brazilians would like it to be like this. So we have Brazilians that are religious people, Brazilians that have a hard hand in terms of fighting violence. And only to show you a few points here, we also have a legalization of abortion. This is also important. Only 16% of Brazilians are in favor of the legalization of abortion. This shows an agenda of customs. And in all debate, if we analyze the issue of abortion, how it is dealt with in the social media, it is used to organize us against them. So this conservative perspective, and then we can show you some other pieces of information very important in this aspect. And in this first round, what happens? The elect president now, Lula, it was not of his interest, this discussion about costumes, this ideological discussion. This was not a point that was of his interest, even if it was of Bolsonaro's interest, because Bolsonaro was badly assessed in the polls. So it was not by chance that Bolsonaro was using these strategies of ideology. For President Lula, only interested one question for him to ask his voters, with whom Brazilians were more satisfied. Were Brazilians more satisfied with the Bolsonaro's administration or with Lula's administration? This was the balance that Lula wanted for this election. Nevertheless, on the first round, Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism was very successful in the sense of bringing this point of religion, of costume, so that for me, the greatest evidence of this is not only this difference, which is a very small difference, but the way how the National Congress was elected.
So an increase in conservatism in the Senate and the lower chamber in 2022 and regarding 2018, just as there has been also, especially in the Southeast, where there is a greater number of voters attend of electing more right-wing candidates, with the exception of Espírito Santo, with a smaller number of voters in the Southeast. But Minas Gerais, São Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro, we had governors closer, even though in the first round and the second round, they are closer to Bolsonaro. The Emil is the elect governor in Minas Gerais. For the final remarks regarding the runoff, the second round, I think Bolsonaro is strengthened by the ballot, according to his performance that was above the opinion polls, because President-elect Lula is not able to get elected in the first round with the strategy he had, ending the dispute then. And in the runoff vote, we have a reduction of the distance or the gap between the number of votes obtained by President Lula, the now President-elect Lula, and President Bolsonaro. So there is a reduction. It's important to say Bolsonaro reduces by 4 million votes. The difference in the first round was 6 million votes. The difference between the second round was 2 million votes. So he removes 4 million votes of difference regarding President-elect Lula. And this happened, basically, if we take the opinion polls, this basically happened in the first week. What happens in the first week is that Bolsonaro concentrates the agenda. He can get the support from elected governors from Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais states. He gets the support from the current São Paulo governor that starts supporting him. And there is Tarcísio, who leaves the dispute very strongly for the government of São Paulo, who was his ally as well. So he has a combination of strengths and powers in the Southeast that is quite powerful, and allied to that, a strong campaign led by the First Lady and the Minister Damares around the country to bring the vote of women. He brings as a strategy the evangelical vote, because after all, the evangelical vote is it's closer to them, and it would be easier to bring women through that channel. And having done that, there is great growth. Bolsonaro, the fact that come afterwards actually are blocking his growth because he loses the control of the agenda. I have one more minute to end. he has ultimately the phenomena that are of the Venezuelan girls. His speech regarding Venezuelan girls, that he kind of suggests that the girls were very well dressed on a Saturday morning to go out on a date. He suggests a practice of prostitution amongst the girls that did not correspond to reality. This takes a week from him until he decides to justify himself and apologize. And then there is, in parallel to that, there is the speech of de-indexing the minimum wage that caused great concern in Brazil, especially amongst retirees, because minimum wage actually is the basis of the retirement programs and some social programs in Brazil. Concern about de-indexing the minimum wage is very important, even though the president said that he's going to de-index it to improve the lack of trust amongst people, does not make this to be taken seriously after he defended himself. And then there is his supporter, Roberto Jefferson, who he attacks the minister of the Supreme Court. The police goes to his home, and because he had been arrested, he was in home prison, and when he was supposed to be arrested to a jail, he has some bombs, he has some weapons, and starts shooting the law enforcement agents. And that was very bad, because what happens then is that all the agenda that was in favor of Bolsonaro goes against him, which is the question of weaponizing people, police officers. Bolsonaro is in favor of police officers. Bolsonaro is against attacking the Supreme Court. And then people were confused. The media shows that, and there was a certain block, and people didn't know how to behave then. And lastly, on the eve of elections, the attitude of Representative Carlos Zambelli put actually with a gun and threatening a person in the streets. This also led to a negative effect. And so we have the de-indexation question is an opportunity that Lula has for the economy, and we close election with the agenda of the politics that favored Lula more than Bolsonaro. This is what I had to say regarding these things. I wanted to show that an important point is that interventionism. If you allow me, Petra, just one more minute to talk about interventionism, because today this is really active and booming and boosted in the social media regarding interventionism. It gains power. When I mentioned from the second week onwards, when the Bolsonaro supporters start realizing that he loses control of his agenda, there is great increase in the support to intervention, because then they realized that winning the election would be a bit difficult. And then, so just to give you an idea, amongst Bolsonaro voters, those that believe amongst Bolsonaro voters in situational corruption, which is Bolsonaro says that the Labour Party, PT, is corrupt, 53% of Bolsonaro supporters are in favor of military intervention in corruption scenario, according to this opinion poll that is the face of democracy in July 2020. So there is, in fact, all this debate of fraud, intervention. It is born from this perception of lack of trust in institutions and in democracy. We can further discuss this, and apologies for going over my time. It's been wonderful, Luciana, wonderful. Before turning over to Marco Ruediger, I'd like to leave you with 2 points, and to Johannes, and to make this very clear for you to think about it, and then we can answer after Marco's speech. To you, I'd like to give you the question. The fact of the cancelled convictions of former president in 2020, now 2021, does this contribute to the creation of the discourse against the institution for this question regarding Brazilian institutions? I think it is important for you to go into this question for us to understand. We have questions from our audience. You can submit your question on the link that you have below the video. I'm getting questions that move into that. We can go over these things. And I'd like to leave a question for Johannes for later. Considering all of what Luciana told us, is there any kind of historical parallel, political historical parallel to Germany regarding this attitude of voters, not only conservative, but doubting institutions with a very strong moralist agenda? It seems quite contrary to what Johannes shared with us in his speech. So I'd like to ask, after Marco, if there is any kind of historical political parallel this situation of a population regarding the wishes they have regarding their political leaders. Now let's move on to Marco Ruediger, our dean, that is going to wrap up this conversation after two very important and quite striking talks about the electoral process in Germany and in Brazil. And you from Getulio Vargas Foundation with a lot of data, how are you able to map all this fluctuation of the public opinion? It's a mapping that happens in real time, right, Marco? This is a great challenge. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. How are you doing, Petria? Can you hear me? Yes, perfectly all right. Well, we map these things and we match this with several data. I was listening to the previous speeches, extremely interesting, that lead me to reflect. Actually, I would like to move towards a slightly different angle that, of course, is related to what is being said. The point is the following. I believe that the idea of trust is totally core to the problem we had today and we're discussing today. Actually, there are many reasons for polarization to happen the way it happens. For example, if you didn't have extremely charismatic leadership, we wouldn't have such type of polarization as we have today. I felt it was curious in Brazil that one of the, say, center candidates accused the left wing, notoriously Lula, and namely Lula and the Labour Party, of being the inducing element of the birth of radical positionings of Bolsonarism. So the radical people actually led to Bolsonarism. So that was Ciro Gomes, who only had 4% of the votes. And this actually, well, it was not the point. Actually, this is a false question. This, what in my opinion led to the situation were two reasons. The first, continuous weakening of the political center. Increasingly, it was unable to build agendas that dialogue directly with most of the civil society. At the time of the real, our currency, that was very successful fight against inflation in Brazil, led to the election of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, etc. And even so, I remember, professor we had, I and Luciana, Vanderlei Guilherme, has said that the currency gains did not reach the deepest layers that were the subject layers that were more the deepest one. They were not touched by this. And the Labour Party talked to them and talked to other segments and talked above all in the construction of solutions for the civil society that generated development to Brazil that was quite important for a good period of time, over a decade actually. And that this can be pointed very much as a success because of the foreign situation. This is not precisely true. Actually, there were quite interesting, important policies and structuring ones in Brazil with social advances that were quite significant. The policies of quotas of students into university. So state-owned companies that were more conscious, fight discrimination, support, financial support that were better designed, having support to keep kids in schools, development policies. Brazil, actually, if you do the maths, well, people talked a lot about, well, the left wing funded subway or the underground in Caracas. You have to calculate how much the subway cost and how much actually it had in terms of benefit in terms of trade with Venezuela. So these were things that were very poorly put and they were very much distorted. So I'd like to bring up the following question. Polarization depends on various factors, including on very strong charismatic leaderships at the time of weakening of the political center. So this actually led to this alternative of being radical. Trust is the key element. So I think we all are in agreement regarding that. And trust is, well, polarization happened at a scene of radicalized mistrust. And this scenario was built from different facts. This is true. We cannot deny it. But actually, it was actually made exponential due to the construction of narratives by the amplified, used, and distorted of the facts.
And then I think the technology of social platforms, of message apps like WhatsApp and other media, together with the disinformation strategies that were very well planned, also contributed to this process, this radicalization. So going back to the original point, we have to think that trust is a central point here. So the scenario that initially was a positive utopia of all with the increase, so as to speak, of the use of social media, of platforms, internet as a whole, with the increase of the political and civic participation and the different contributions. Each citizen can do it from his own computer, cell phone, that generated a good perspective of a future, was transformed in the dystopia that really was disruptive to society and to the good democratic rule, humanistic and civilization-wise, and even in the increase of the corrosion of the state itself and on the trust on the public figure. So I would say that just an example, when we see the data from Bertelsmann Stiftung, from Bertelsmann Foundation, if you compare the index or in the indicator of democracy development and compare just Brazil, and you do this according to a timeline with the tools available, if you compare data from this year in the Bolsonaro administration and the Lula administration, you see the several dimensions of what would be a good structure, a good administration, and then you see a retraction, a very clear-cut retraction in this sense. So mistrust was used, and the manipulation of this lack of trust to corrode even more the trust. And this is a loop, a kind of a loop which is very negative and very destructive. And from this point, we favored polarization, But nevertheless, in this spirit, in this route, what we saw was a continuity of this corrosion of trust, because a significant part of the Bolsonaro's defeat happened because he betrayed the public trust, especially during pandemics. Not that the pandemics could have been avoided, but it could have been minimized. It could have, its impact could have been dealt with in a different way. And also a great empathy from the government was missing. In that occasion, Bolsonaro and his capacity of empathy with the people, or an effort of the public machine here in Brazil that has a vaccination system which is very efficient and was almost stopped because of ideological points. And this was a summation then of continuous mistrust of the Bolsonaro administration and the promises that they made. For instance, the allowances that were provided recently because of the Brazil's economic situation, of the increase of poverty and hunger, they were very clearly not realizable in the 2023 budget. So the trust in the government dissolved itself. So we have a situation that is the following. Lula's election was a response in a certain way to preserve democracy and a resuming of a humanistic and solidarity approach of people that are concerned with inequalities, with inclusion, even though I didn't believe that this is that important. Now looking for the future, that the Lula's administration will try to radicalize these points. It's going to abide by the law, for instance, quotas, social inclusion, allowances, all of this they will maintain, of course, but they will concentrate in a few other things, in the administrative reform, in tax reform, and it is the government that will have a difficulty in its relationship with the Congress. Concessions will need to be made. And then I asked, how will they be able to recover a trust level that will not allow a situation of polarization that was so radicalized, and once again a frustration of voters. I have to repeat this. The continuous frustration of voters generate room enough for extreme radicalized right-wing politicians that is almost pro-fascist in their approach. And then, yes, we can be harmed in this point. And the objective Bolsonaro is exactly this, a unitary executive that cannot be counterbalanced by the other powers. And actually, this was not possible to be accomplished. That's why he lost for Mr. Lula. And it was not essential, but in my understanding, not enough to win the polarization. So the rescue of this credibility, of some trust in the capacity of a democratic state, of a democracy and a policy of making consistent deliveries to civil society, especially related to the expectations that we see, or of the clarity of their difficulties and limits, become a core of the business. The trust is not only the final result of the delivery, but all the process of what is possible and how we build an agenda of priorities according to what is possible. President Lula, during the election, sometimes mentioned on this process. He said that people would be able to discuss in the discussion of the budget and on the priority of the budget. When he said it, he made a rescue of the idea of the participative budget. And this is an idea that comes from some years ago, started in Rio Grande do Sul, and he in some way understood, or somebody told him, and using the means of communication, he believes that this is possible. I don't see this agenda emerging, and this concerns me a lot, because I believe that actually the possibility of using the same media that helped to increase and speed up the corrosion of trust in democracy can be used to avoid, protect democracy itself, and even recover part of the credibility that is necessary for a good administration in the country and trust in the institutions. So I ask if it is possible in this scenario to develop alternatives that bring a new way of public administration. What would be the role of civil society in this, and how communication and transparency could be elements that help develop a new way of administration. And here are a few points, because it doesn't seem to me that we can once and for all to remove the possibility of having a return of Bolsonarism if we don't do in Brazil a certain kind of re-engineering of the democratic structures. And this will only be possible, it is possible, of course, using efficiently the communication tools and the same elements that helped to increase the size of the radicalization of polarization. So how the sector and different democratic areas can recover this power that cannot be used not only during elections, but as a continuous way of civic participation in the process of administration and transparency in the country, and the increase of trust in those conducting the country and the institutions. I'm concerned with this because even if this had been tackled very shallowly in the campaign, it was, and even if other agendas are actually a priority, the country and especially the democratic arena has to be concerned that it cannot fail. And this means a kind of a boldness, something that we would call of counterfires. And the counterfires in society of information in Brazil is a society that is highly dependent on IT. Everybody has their cell phones, everybody goes to the digital and social media. And all of this is so present in the Brazilians' life that you today listen to radio using social media, you watch TV using social media. So it's a radical change, pivotal in all the world. And because of it, it's most susceptible to misinformation. This has to become an integral part of the strategy of public policy so that we don't revisit this terrible situation that we went through in the past 4 years, and we avoid things like manifestations, fascist manifestations that happen in several regions in the country. So I close here, just bringing this. I agree that trust is a core element. I believe that several factors contributed to this, and I believe that communication and digital communication was a great element that was pivotal for the win of the right, and it's also a great element that can help to strengthen democracy. But I don't see in the agenda today this being included as an absolute priority. I believe that most part of the politicians have a mistrust in this transparency, and this is a problem that we will have to deal with. And this is what I had to say to you right now in this moment. Brilliant. I believe that this is the perfect point for us to return with Johannes. We are getting fantastic questions from our public. We have a link here under our transmission. I'm going to start asking these questions to all our panelists. I just wanted to turn the floor to Johannes so that we can link what Marcos says about what are the guarantees that we have, the antidotes against fascisms of all orders? What are the antidotes that we have against totalitarian regimes of all order? And perhaps tell Johannes or ask him what I was asking, if there is a parallel, perhaps we have it, even because of Germany's political story. What parallels can we find among the political movements that happen, and how Germany itself went against to foster these antibodies that might guarantee democracy, Johannes, so that we can learn a little bit with this dialogue. See, yes, thank you very much. Thank you also very much to both speakers that spoke before me. And now, because of their very interesting interventions, I'm going to start making some parallels because they exist, actually. It's not that now we have a party from the right wing that can have a majority, but we have this party is the right-wing populist movement that is strengthening and has been going on like this in the past 10 years between Bolsonarism and this German populist movement. And we find very interesting parallels between these two. We have a party in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, that is in the parliament with elements from the extreme right-wing populists. They radicalized themselves in the past years, and now they are under observation of our secret service. The protection to the Constitution is a German secret service that is inside Germany, and that watches groups that are against the Constitution.
Actually, this secret service we have instituted after the National Socialism that we had in Germany in the past century. And we also call it protection to democracy. It's a concept that has been developed after National Socialism. The secret service that we have internally is the police that has the possibility of observing groups that are against the Constitution. And AfD, the political party, is being observed this year officially because of extreme right-wing attitudes. This party, it's very important to note that this party tries to always go into media with international populist movements. It's been interesting also after the elections in Brazil, a very well-known person, Beatriz von Storch, after the elections in Brazil, she just articulated this idea of possible fraud in Brazil. Even before Bolsonaro said anything, it took a while until he made a statement. And this party in Germany already at the time, just as in the time of Donald Trump, took on this narrative of electoral or fraud. And we see some parallels as the right-wing populist movements are connected and learned from each other. And this German party has learned and has embraced a lot of the other players or right-wing. They learned a lot from Trump, exchanging with Steve Bannon, Trump's aide. And with that, we find with this narrative and messages, we see a lot of parallels in what Luciana has described. This atmosphere of anti-democracy, anti-institutions. This is part of populism, radicalism of parties in Germany, but there's another element that is as important as that and is quite characteristic. They are against migration. So it's a populist, extreme right-wing party that also has identity politics. They want a society that is culturally homogeneous. They reject migration. And this is being seen very strongly so in 2015. And now, well, at the time it was the war in Syria, where a lot of refugees from the Arabic countries came to Germany, and they sort of incited hate against the refugees. Asylums were attacked, or the shelters were attacked at the time, and this party, through its attitude and speeches, they have been sowing hate, poisoning people, which led people to intervene against refugees, having violent attitudes. And we saw some shelters in fire. And there are some parallels. And another parallel is the use of social media. The AFD party is a party that has great outreach in social media, much more on Facebook compared to the other parties. In Germany, the party grew with social media. The party was founded less than 10 years ago, and its setting up is strictly linked to the coming up of social media. They created an extreme right-wing bubble, what I described before, that we have minority in Germany, very receptive for disinformation that is very suspicious of institutions. This segment of the population is a clientele of this party. This is where they find supporters, and it is in this segment that they were able to get quite loyal voters, because AFT voters are very much linked to the party. Democratic parties cannot even reach these people, these voters. We have a constellation of different parties in Germany. There are 6 parties, and the AfD party is enclosed in itself, and usually voters migrate between democratic parties. They move from conservative to more liberalism to green ones. So there is constant migration of voters, great flotation between parties, and this loyalty of voters by parties has been greatly reduced. And precisely this extreme right-wing party, AfD, was able to get a great loyalty. This is a specific feature of it. But in Germany as a whole, they have up 15% in opinion polls. They are far from a majority, and they're also unable to get a coalition, because in Germany, usually you cannot rule without coalition. No party wants to set up a coalition with AfD, these extreme right-wing party. There is another specificity in Eastern Germany. Former RDA, we are a federal country with 17 federal states, and we have state governments that are strong, and then this power is distributed at the federation level, which would be union in Brazil. The state cultural, educational policies are actually up to the states to determine. In the east of Germany, this extreme right-wing party ranks first. This actually creates great concern in all democratic players, because this does not mean that they could set up a coalition there. But as people were very receptive and open to this party, AFT, it is concerning. And it has led to many discussions. The last point that, well, Luciana has also addressed that. So moralist institutions, they also have a role in Germany. Yes, to a certain extent, yes. This populist extreme right-wing movement, they kind of play this song. It's this social cultural position in Germany. We have a definition of political competition through a dimension of socio-economic conflict. They are distributive justice issues, for example, tax policy, this would be socio-economic, but we also have this dimension of social cultural conflict, which are value issues. But here we have self-determination, gender identity. This goes into social cultural definition. And the right-wing populist party works with these issues. When they look at their program, we will find cultural positionings and less economic questions. What is most important to people when they vote? Economic issues, because then they could tend to other parties, or are those cultural questions? And they would tend, therefore, more to a party like AFD. So it is related to problems, what concerns people, what moves people. And obviously, many times economic issues are culturalized, and they are overlapping economic issues. So this party tries to do that, to put cultural issues above and overlapping economic issues. And I see this happening, and I see this attempt of approaching the extreme right-wing party, Germany, to I actually associated to Bolsonaro and Trump, because many of the things that Bolsonaro and Trump have managed to do, AFD has not yet, but they would like to. So they are guided by the others that already have reached that point. Perfect, Johannes. Well, perfectly put. Very interesting. All this articulation that he comments, right, Luciana, on structures to monitor democracy. And it seems to me that this is beginning to be discussed here in Brazil now, still with the confusion with what is freedom of speech, what I can and cannot say, what is hate speech, what is not, and it's still, everything is still very confusing. We have a question from our audience to you. The first question that has been asked that I want to ask of you, it's a question from Anna that is very much linked to everything we're talking about. Anna asks the following: polarization is intensified every year in Brazil after the dispute between Dilma and ISU. Do you consider that we could have acted before to avoid the current situation? I remember a question I asked to Minister Barroso. I questioned whether justice, electoral justice overall, had not underestimated the power of social media way back when, before 2018. So I'd like you to set a context on polarization, if we could have acted before or earlier. So there's another question about conservatism that I'd like to ask of you and Marco. Shall I answer it now, or should I talk about conservatism? No, you can answer it now, and then we'll ask the next one. Right. So bringing up some questions that you have brought up before, I'm going to answer this one and this one by the audience. When we talked about trust, I go back to the question whether the withdrawn convictions of current elect president Lula led to a speech of attacking institutions, of attacking the Supreme Court and the Labour Party and the left wing overall. They did. There is something that is quite interesting, that we have conducted some studies trying to realize what is the impact of corruption. Corruption. The theme of corruption does not have an equal reach to all candidates at all times. At some points, it attains more success and others less. So, for example, the theme of corruption of the Lava Jato at the occasion of the impeachment of President Dilma had a great impact after the economy had. So what happens first? What actually weakens the adhesion to the support to President Dilma is a weakened economy, and then people start accepting reports of corruption and putting her as a justification to be against her. So the first thing that we have to think is the situation. So what we have to remember is the chorus overall. So we have what 2013, everything, the manifestations of 2013, everything is transformed. A great drop, abrupt drop in the evaluation of all administration, Dilma, president, state governors, questioning never seen before regarding all democratic institutions, the Congress, judiciary, the political parties, everything is challenged in an unprecedented way. Life seems to change overnight regarding institutions and democracy. After this process, what happens? We have elections of President Dilma that still is able to be re-elected despite the general questioning that happened after 2013. However, she's unable to end her term and power because there is an exponential growth in terms of reports regarding Lava Jato, and there is an increase in inflation with an energetic crisis and several factors. Brazilians lose normalcy, their purchasing power. This weakens the president in the public opinion. This impacts the National Congress because she loses a shield in the public opinion in Congress. And then we have her impeachment. And then we have a Labour Party that is very weakened, a loss of support to the Labour Party, a lot of street movements that are conservative, with a speech against the Labour Party, PT, and this corruption discourse gains power gradually from the reports. And after the impeachment of President Dilma, this only grows.
Then we have Bolsonaro's speech, very much focused in the first instance related to PT, and then through all the system in general, going after the car wash. And these convictions has a weight in Brazil. And the speech of corruption has greater weight and works more when it is against PT. So every time that the speech of corruption reaches PT is more successful than the others. If you're going to talk about the corruption on other parties, it's not as strong as the weight put on the corruption against PT. So it's a strategy that knows that has positive results. It is calculated when they associate corruption and President Bolsonaro, and they are going to work on a former convicted person, on a corrupt person. This is a speech that helps. And Bolsonaro in this speech is within the theory of conspiracy that is in the social media, disqualifies PT and disqualifies the Supreme Court when they say that in the last instance, the Supreme Court gives privileges to certain parties and does not provide the role it should. Therefore, it is questionable the actions and efficiency as representatives of the population, and not for this reason when we say that the Bolsonarist Democrats, because you have to be very careful with this issue of democracy, because the Bolsonarist segments also understand themselves as Democrats, because they believe that they have to guarantee freedom, representation that the Supreme Court and the media cannot provide to the population. So currently, when we ask about democracy, we have to be very careful with what democracy are we talking about. So answering this first question, I would say this. And as for trust, I believe that Brazil has serious problems of trust in the institutions. The trust, interpersonal trust, is very serious in Brazil as well. And here I highlight in this last question of yours, when you mention what Johannes had mentioned before. That is the point of how can we provide a rescue of trust by the institutions. I would say that the work of the Electoral Court was very well conducted, because for 2 or 3 years we have seen very fiercely this speech of electoral fraud. The speech of electoral fraud is very strong. It went through several points, and we even have international literature that was included here. The points of the electronic ballots in the United States was the vote via mail, and then you have the polls. If the polls show different points or similar points, even when they show different points, is a signal of fraud. And we have this here and international literature showing this. And then we analyze the numbers of FGV, and you see these. We only talk about electronic ballot, then only about electoral poll. After this, we go to military intervention. So you have these movements that trying to make a mess of all of this. Now we want to impeach the election, and their speech now is to say that the president should turn the elections null and void. This is what they're speaking now. So all of this, the Supreme Electoral Court guarantee an election, very difficult to be guaranteed. They showed their strength. They showed their control. And a point that I'm going to give as an example about the challenge of the Electoral Court, where they were successful, was that, for instance, we were doing polls about discussion groups about the legitimacy of democracy, what Brazilians understood about this. We used 8 focus groups on this, and one voter said, well, do you trust in the ballot? People has many difficulties of saying that they trust, and this person said he didn't trust, and he said, do you know why I don't trust? Do you know when you go to the gas station and you're going to fuel up your car, do you see that the hose is black? If it's a black hose, you don't know exactly what fuel is going through that. So there is a lot of mistrust here in Brazil. People mistrust people that fuel up your car. And then if they do this, they even can mistrust if the votes are being counted correctly or not. So we have to rescue this. And one of the way of rescuing this is, in a last instance, bringing to the dialogue the parties, bringing to the dialogue society. And so we have, it's not only the churches that are coming to a dialogue already with President Lula. So we have to smoothen these points, both in the organized society with the Congress, trying to avoid in the future to facing this challenge of the extreme right. Petria, I said too much. I don't know if I missed anything that you asked. Wonderful, Luciana. I just wanted to turn the floor to Marco, but if you wanted to make any intervention or add anything, also Johannes, to what I'm going to ask to Marco now, please feel comfortable. You talk about the strengths of the institutions, the role of the Electoral Court that showed their strengths. We went to this electoral process with a lot of concern. Another point that I raised, making an analysis of what you mentioned, the questioning of Marco about how are we going to do to rebuild this grid of trust. Even the journalism was very much challenged. When Johannes tells us that 80% of the population in Germany, they collect information from television and not from the social media. We see a big difference here with our population that currently, I don't have figures here, perhaps Marco can even tell us, but we saw a consumption of information and misinformation so big because of social media, because even journalism as a pillar of democracy was challenged. I have a question from Patrick, and he says the following. In this point of strength, institution, questioning of the ballots, what is the role of the institution army in this moment, collaborating, asking when any federal intervention is requested? The role of this army, perhaps, in the last government as an institution. And I wanted to add to this another point. A few days ago, I interviewed in my program in CBN the psychanalyst Cristiano Dunker. And he raised a point that is very important. In the case of Germany, an interruption was done, a judgment was done. Everybody was named who was to blame, who was totalitarian. Here in Brazil, the guilt of the dictatorship didn't happen. So perhaps I would like you to think a little bit in this sense. How can we rescue our past also so that we can have a better future in terms of the democratic basis? I will turn this to you, Marco, talking about the army, talking about history, and talking about the present. I think his microphone is off. Here we go. I'm going to try to be very brief so that everybody can speak, right? I believe that the army, when you analyze, there is a big difference in those military people that were in the government and those that command the troops. I believe that the army as an institution. I remember an interview that I had during the electoral process with several newspapers, even international as New York Times and others. And they always ask the same question: what about the army? Are they going to support Bolsonaro? Are they going to join the coup? And I always said, no. I always found the army as an institution with a level of professionalization, which is very big. And I never saw this possibility. You see manifestations, you didn't see manifestations of the commanders of the troops. You saw these from retirees, even those that were not more in the active service, right? And so actually what we saw at the end of the process was the army not intervening. They don't want to change any rule. They don't want to meddle on this. The army as an institution, they tried some specific interests of theirs that are negotiated in politics, as it should be, as any institution does. So specifically, the most important was the Brazilian judiciary. The judiciary power had a hypertrophied dimension, and I believe that in a certain way, it's an expectation that the judiciary shrinks a little bit from now on, because you won't have an executive now that will be radicalizing, going against, trying to reform the role of the executive and change the rules that is in our contract with the Constitution. This is not going to happen. So what the judiciary should have done, they already did it. They had a hypertrophied action, even because the protection of a number of rights and liberties, even those mentioned in the Constitution, so they had to act like that. And I find that this is very interesting because the way as it was done created to me a case when Minister Moraes says that the platforms, they are not only a service of exchange of information, but they have a role as an industry of communication. I believe that this is a very interesting point because he directed his action and showed very clearly that the platforms has a role as an instrument of information, like a radio, like a newspapers that has a series of legal limitations concerning the social responsibilities that they have in terms of disclosing information, and not only a service that provides a platform of communication. They have that role of providing information in the industry of information. So I believe that this is a world case because this is a great point. For instance, we had in Germany a discussion with the German government in Telegram. And that also inspired a little bit the actions of Minister Moraes. So what is the role of Telegram? How much the platforms can simply be giving room for a disconstruction of democracy, so as to speak, to a corrosion of the institutional beliefs, the freedom of rights and of expression. What is its limit? Can you use democracy to destroy democracy itself? No. So these points have been very well tackled. And in this case, the judiciary is a case study that can even show itself as a standard in this case. Now, after this period is over, a healthy trend would be the judiciary to decrease its hypertrophied action and allow the powers to understand themselves better. This is what I believe. So I don't see, I believe that Brazil will move towards a return to normality. My question is, how much will it be sustainable if the level of corrosion of trust remains high? And how much the institutions fail in delivering to society all the commitments that they signed during the electoral process. And above all, the only medicine I see is how much they are able to increase transparency. It's interesting, President Lula during the elections mentioning several times when he was asked about corruption that he had, and he really did, institute a series of measures and instances of control and transparencies that we didn't have before. And actually, this happened. Even the strengthening of the prosecutor's office, the choice of the triple lists for the positions of checking and public actions of the judiciary control agencies. So something that Bolsonaro president didn't do. He simply chose from the list who he wanted.
So for the prosecutor's office, so actually this was necessary, important, but not enough. This is the point, not enough. In a society in which the information flow is given in real time and people are impacted by this kind of information many times that is distorted, the number of thousands and millions as we monitor at our communication school, there are simply necessary conditions, but not sufficient to ensure the perception and building of fiduciary items in society. So I think it is extremely important to have an advance in terms of the institutional development towards expanding transparency and translating, so to speak, public priorities, the budget and the use of public funding, and using this for civil society. Otherwise, we're going to have a return of the situation once again. This is my view. Perfectly, Mark. I'm going to take this as the final remarks. That is something that you bring up for new discussions, new webinars, monitoring, new debates that more than ever, this is what needs to be discussed for our democracy. considering everything we've said, I'd like to ask for Johannes' final remarks, and considering everything that has been said, considering the expectations that we have, right, Johannes, not only for Brazilian democracy, not only for German democracy, but for democracy and in times of digital stages. Thank you very much. Looking ahead into the future, I would like to describe a challenge that we are confronted with in Germany. And Marco has mentioned this when he talked about Telegram, regulation of digital platforms. And when we talk about regulation, it means to us to turn the rules and laws effective that are applied to the analog world, they should be applied to the digital world. And there we face great difficulties. The platforms operate globally, so the global space is not comparable to the analog, which is national. This is a challenge to have the enforcement of laws. That's why in European Union, there's an attempt of having a common regulation of platforms. There we have greater chance, greater scope, more strength to actually enforce those rules as we act as joint European Union and thinking about the Digital Service Act. And years ago with the RGPG, which is the General Data Protection Data Protection Law, of also reliability and responsibility. And this should proceed beyond Europe. And we need global alliances of democracies to fight non-democratic phenomena, anti-democratic phenomena in the digital space to attain global governance. There are certain cooperations beyond Europe, for example, at NATO, the German government and the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Germany are active in this sphere. This cooperation is still limited more to exchanging of information and knowledge transfer, but they are important forms of cooperation in this fight against disinformation. Now, with the war of Russia against Ukraine, we see how disinformation becomes a weapon, and it's a psychological weapon. And it does not happen only in Ukraine, and it happens and it is perceived in many other countries. So it is not a war only against the Ukraine, but other democratic countries that people try to destabilize. We need more cooperation between democratic countries in the global sphere to be able to master and control these phenomena of disinformation, have the Brazil-Germany cooperation, having Europe and South America, the greater, the better, as we have and see in other areas of political areas of climate, for example. And then we create a kind of club of democracies so as to regulate digital platforms, so as to reinforce and enforce democratic rules on the platforms. Thank you very much. It's been extremely interesting debate, and I would like to say goodbye now. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much. Johannes, we thank you very much. I'd like to have your final remarks, Luciana, for us to wrap up. People are asking whether with the elections conservative tend to be reduced in Brazil or not. And I'd like to have your remarks, final remarks on this debate. Has been so powerful and so profound. It's been a great pleasure to talk to Johannes and Marco. And I'd like to make Johannes' final remarks, my final remarks. The first diagnosis that Marco mentioned, the need that we have of dealing with this problem which is a problem that may be positive or negative regarding democracy. And this effort, I like this idea very much of the democracy club, seeking cooperation on the global sphere, just as we have regarding the environment, on the fight against disinformation, which in fact is a very serious problem regarding democracy. So I'd like to reinstate both Marco and Johannes' speeches because they have been very accurate in this aspect. I would also like to say, Petria, that the press, we talked a lot about the electoral high court. I'd like to talk about the traditional press. It's interesting regarding what Johannes said regarding Germany in terms of the trust that people have in the traditional press. The trust in the press is within the polarization. There was a great divide between the increase that we've noticed of adhering to democracy, the increase we've noticed regarding adhering to electoral justice. We also notice the same increase in the trust in the press. It's being recognized, acknowledged. The population was able to do that, especially after the pandemic, because the press was very important during the pandemic. It left the pandemic with a much better reputation, but that was much better than it had in 2018, despite the conservatism. Well, conservatism, then I'm going to go to my last point. Conservatism itself is part of the game. Some are more conservative, others more progressive. We're here to have a fluctuation of power. There's no problem whatsoever. It may even be very healthy to have a fluctuation of power. Some more progressive, more conservative. This has an impact to the economy, to a balance. This is part of democracy. It's very healthy to have this sort of round robin of power. We cannot allow some anti-democratic speeches. Anti-democratic speeches removes us this possibility of disagreeing and having this turn in terms of power. I hope that ultimately we may have a government project that will make a difference, that will rescue trust. I believe that gradually it will be able to rescue the trust and reduce differences, and so that we can get to 2026 reliving what was Brazil in the past few years before this right-wing radicalism. So these are my final words. I thank Marco and Amaro for the opportunity of being here with you today. A pleasure to have met you and Johannes. Thank you. So actually, it's been a very special meeting promoted by the School of Communication, Media and Information of the Getulio Vargas Foundation with the support of the German Embassy. We have Marco Ruediger, director of the School of Communication, Media and Information, and Luciana Veiga, she's just left the presidency of the Brazilian Association of Political Science, and Johannes Hillje, who is a policy and communication consultant in Berlin, working for various institutions in Germany for this debate and this reflection that has been so deep. This is one of the most diverse reflections that the School of Communication of the Getulio Vargas Foundation is going to promote. We end up here, and we hope this whole conversation has fostered your reflection and looking at what is necessary regarding politics, democracy, and social media. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, and see you next time.